Welcome to Stories with a Twang. I'm Nathan. For this week's episode, I'm going to read 2 stories from 13 Tennessee Ghosts and Jeffrey from Kathryn Tucker Windham. Our first story is called The Barrel of Sin. The revival at the New Hope Missionary Baptist Church was nearly over. For more than a week, families in the Big Springs community of Rutherford County had gathered nightly at the small rural church for the annual ritual of spiritual renewal. The worshipers who lived close to the church walked to the services. Others rode to the church on horseback or jolted over the rocky roads in buggies and mule-drawn wagons. While the women and children went into the church to choose their seats, the men loitered outside to tie their animals to the long hitching poles beneath the trees and to brag on their crops, tell a few stories, or discuss the weather, speaking in subdued tones as befitting a churchyard. Not until the congregation began singing the opening hymn did most of the men break off their conversations and join their families inside the sultry building. "Hope he don't preach about hell tonight. It's already too hot inside the church house," a sweating farmer whispered. He was standing inside the door and looking around to see where his wife was sitting. "Amen," his companion answered, ever so softly. It was hot. The string of bright, rainless days had dried up gardens and had lowered the water level in some wells so drastically that the ropes on the buckets had to be lengthened. There was even some uneasiness that, unless rains came soon, the creek would be so low the baptizings would have to be postponed. Ever since the church was established in 1846, baptism of new converts had always been held the Sunday after the revival closed. But now the creek was so shallow that immersions would be impossible. It would be a pity to have to put off the baptisms. An unusually large number of people had asked to be received into the fellowship of the church. Among the first converts to join the church was Miss Bertha. On the second verse of the invitational hymn, the very first night of the revival, she squeezed past the people on her bench, walked down the aisle, and gave her hand to the waiting preacher. It wasn't Miss Bertha's first trip down that aisle. She joined every summer. The thing was, she was a faithful joiner of the Methodist Church, too. The Methodists genuinely had their revival early in the summer, and Miss Bertha was always right there to receive the right hand of Christian fellowship when the preacher announced that the doors of the Methodist Church were open. Then, 8 or 10 weeks later, when the Baptists had their revival, she would switch allegiances and ask for membership in the Baptist fellowship. So, actually, Miss Bertha's joining didn't actually count. It was widely felt, however, that she was more Baptist than Methodist, even though her joinings were equal in number, since she stayed Baptist all through the fall, winter, and spring until the Methodist revival in June. But she would have to be baptized again, since she had requested it. Miss Bertha and all the rest of the new members would have to wait a while for their baptizings, unless the rains came soon. There was lightning that night, though not the kind that promised rain. It was heat lightning, flashing about the sky, far off. Inside the church, the heat was oppressive. No breeze came through the open windows. The only stirring of air came from the dozens of fans, palmettos, turkey tails, folding fans painted with scenes of faraway beaches, stiff cardboard ovals embossed with colorful advertisements, heavy paper creased into accordion pleats, held in dozens of swaying hands. Babies uncomfortable in the heat whimpered until they went to sleep in their mother's arms. As they fell asleep, their mothers, one by one, tiptoed to the front of the church and gently laid the babies on a pallet spread just to the left of the pulpit. The pallet that night was a quilt of the bear paw pattern, a quilt described by its owner as most wore out, but soft for babies to rest on. Older children overcome by sleep stretched out on the bare benches, if there was room, or leaned over and rested their heads on their mother's laps. Neither the restless stirring of the babies on the pallet, occasionally a mother would leave her seat and go up to pacify a wakeful infant, nor the uncoordinated movements of the fans distracted the preacher. He was preaching about hell, and he was warming up to his subject. He was in the midst of bellowing a fearful description of the never-ending tortures of the unsaved, when the services were interrupted in a most peculiar and spectacular way. A barrel spurting thick smoke at each end appeared from nowhere and rolled clattering and smoking right up to the pulpit. It looked like the preacher had conjured up a living sample of hell. Mothers ran to the front of the church to snatch their babies from the pallet. Fathers dragged groggy children outside the church. Some worshippers climbed over the benches and jumped out the windows. The preacher pushed past the stampeding choir and escaped through the back door. Later, he said he was trying to clear a safe exit for the singers, but nobody else remembered it quite that way. Horses and mules, as terrified as their owners, broke from their tethers and ran away into the darkness. After everybody was safely outside, after the screaming and crying and praying for deliverance had subsided, a group of the bravest men ventured back into the church to investigate. A haze of dark smoke hung over the front of the church, but there was no barrel in the building. The men searched everywhere inside the church. There was only one room, so there weren't many places to look for the clattering barrel or for its charred remains, but they found nothing. Then they looked outside, under the church, on top of the church, around the church, in the woods, in the graveyard. There was no barrel. It had vanished completely. Only intangibles, a smoky haze, and frightening memories remained. "Nothing here. Whatever it was is gone. We might as well go home too," the spokesman for the group said. So they walked home, all of them, keeping close together and not talking much. By the next day, news of the smoking, clanking barrel that had broken up the meeting at the New Hope Missionary Baptist Church had spread all over Rutherford and Canyon communities. People who had been there told of the events again and again, tried to answer the questions they were asked, or became silent when confronted by rude doubters. The accounts of the event were not alike in every detail. Some witnesses said the barrel made a circuit around the outside of the church before it entered and rolled up the aisle to the pulpit. Others testified that the barrel made its first appearance at the rear of the church, where it bumped and clanked toward the pulpit. They all agreed, however, that the barrel appeared without warning, that smoke poured from each end, and that it made a terrible racket, like it might have been filled with trace chains and plow points that clattered together as it rolled along. Search for the barrel or for some tangible evidence of its strange visitation continued for several days, but nothing was ever found. After the smoky haze drifted away, only the memories remained. Yet people going to the church, curiosity drew hundreds of visitors to the site, became uncomfortably aware that something, some powerful force, some unseen presence, some hidden menace, had come to New Hope. Pretty soon, there was widespread talk that New Hope Church was haunted. There was talk, too, first whispered and later spoken boldly, about the cause of the haunting. The restless, tormented spirit of a murdered man was seeking retribution. According to the story, a resident of the Big Springs area, a highly respected man, had killed a pack peddler who stopped by the man's house for shelter from a sudden summer storm. Motive for the murder was never clear, but the murderer was reported to have robbed his victim, stuffed his body into a barrel, weighted the barrel with scrap iron, and thrown it into a swift stream. Nobody provided positive proof of such a brutal deed, but there were those in the community who declared the story could be verified if you just looked in the right place. The murderer, the story continued, was tormented by the memory of what he had done. He was basically a good, kind man, and he tried to salve his conscience by giving the stolen money to the church, New Hope. The congregation had been meeting in homes in the community for several months while an effort was underway to build a church. Land had been acquired, labor promised, and money for the building was being collected. This was in the late 1840s, a dozen or more years before the incident of the barrel. The generous and unexpected gift of the murderer, though no one suspected him of evil doing at the time, made the building possible. So you see, sinful money went into the church house. Sinful money. That's the meaning of that barrel with its smoking racket. It was purely a barrel of sin, a deacon explained. Maybe that was the explanation. Maybe not. But other strange things began to happen around New Hope Church. People passing the church at night began to tell of seeing weird lights darting about, glowing balls of brightness that chased them down the road. Other people told of hearing a baby crying at the deserted church. The baby would cry, they said, until a passerby walked to a certain tombstone in the graveyard and touched it. Then the crying would stop. Nobody could ever find where the crying was coming from. There were also reports of a headless man who would appear out of the darkness and try to get into passing wagons or to climb up behind riders on horseback. They say that one night, long after midnight, the headless man appeared to a local fiddler. The fiddler had been playing for a dance at a house not far away. He had been warned many times that fiddling and dancing were works of the devil, and he was taking a shortcut home through the churchyard. He was whistling, not to keep up his courage, but because he was happy, when right in front of him he saw the headless man. The fiddler started running, so did the headless man. The fiddler tripped over a root and stumbled headfirst to the ground. The fall knocked the breath out of him. When his head cleared, a quick survey assured the fiddler that the headless man was gone, but his precious fiddle was broken to smithereens. Then there is the tale they told of the man who was dared to spend the night in the church. He was a brave man, not the kind who would take a dare, so he went to the church and let himself in. The church was no more scary than any other dark, isolated building is, so the man stretched out on a bench up near the front and went to sleep. Along about midnight, he woke up. Stiffness from sleeping on the hard bench may have awakened him, or it may have been the bright moonlight shining through the window by his head. He got up from the bench, stretched, and started to walk across the aisle. Suddenly, he was surrounded by a cluster of moaning, ghostly figures. Brave though he was, the man wanted to bolt from the church, but the ghost blocked his exit. What could he do? He had nothing to defend himself with. In desperation, he snatched up the collection plates and started toward the figures, waving the plates in front of him. The ghost disappeared instantly. To be truthful, that incident probably did not happen at New Hope. It's the kind of tale that makes good listening, and it may not have happened anywhere. Enough strange things did happen at New Hope, though appearances of the headless man and the darting lights, and the crying baby and such, that there was a marked decline in the size of the congregation. Finally, the leaders decided to tear the old church down. The congregation was not disbanded. A new church was built right across the road. The hauntings ceased. Gradually, people quit talking about the mysterious barrel and the other ghostly occurrences there. As years passed, the events were almost forgotten, except by a few old storytellers who passed the tales from generation to generation. New Hope Missionary Baptist Church is an active, thriving church now. There's preaching there every Sunday and prayer meeting on Wednesday nights. Our final story is called The Exorcism of Aunt Crecy. For almost 40 years, a gentle ghost haunted the old Eakin home at 610 North Jefferson Street in Shelbyville. People who lived in the house called the spirit Aunt Crecy, though she was not really kin to them. Her real name was Lucretia Pearson Eakin, wife of John Eakin, and she had lived in that house for half a century before her death in the early 1890s. Lucretia Pearson grew up in the Flat Creek community near Shelbyville. Her family traded in Shelbyville, making the 7-mile trip by wagon, and it was there that she met a prosperous Irish merchant named John Eakin. Courtship followed that meeting. As Lucretia, her family and friends called her Crecy, talked shyly of becoming Mrs. Eakin, her friends teased, "Will you be Mrs. John Eakin or Mrs. Spencer Eakin? Mrs. Alexander Eakin or Mrs. William Eakin? Or perhaps you will be Mrs. Thomas Eakin. Which one of those fine Irish lads will you wed? Can you tell them apart, Crecy?" And though Crecy blushingly replied that it was John Eakin she intended to marry, as they all knew, she did understand how there could be some confusion with so many young men in the Eakin family. John, Crecy's intended, had come to Shelbyville from Ireland in 1817. 3 years later, his brother Spencer joined him. The brothers became business partners, were so successful, and wrote letters containing such enthusiastic accounts of opportunities in the area that in 1822 the entire Eakin family, with the exception of one married sister, crossed the Atlantic and made their way to Shelbyville. Having chosen his bride, John built a tall, sturdy, red brick house out on Fairfield Pike, the first of 5 such substantial dwellings built by the Eakin family. The property is now a part of Shelbyville, but at the time it was built, it was out in the country. Mrs. Eakin was so proud of her fine house, but she did wish that her husband had built it in town. Having grown up in the country, she had always looked forward to living in town where she could have close neighbors, could be in walking distance of stores and shops, and could be near the church. Being near the church was what she wanted most of all. She was a devout Presbyterian, and it troubled her that the distance from her home to Shelbyville Presbyterian Church kept her from being as faithful in attendance as she wanted to be. She seldom missed Sunday worship, but it was not always convenient or even possible for her to attend midweek prayer services and meetings of the women's missionary groups, or to be active in other work of the church. So Mrs. Eakin, Crecy, began a gentle campaign to persuade her husband to move to town. She was a good, loving, obedient wife, but she used every possible opportunity to call her husband's attention to the desirability of establishing residence in downtown Shelbyville. In her campaign, she leaned heavily on her wish to be near the Presbyterian Church, while her husband might readily dismiss her desire for close neighbors, or her wish to be near stores and shops. He could not fail to be impressed by her desire to be more deeply involved in the work of the church. Her campaign was not immediately successful. Crecy had not expected it to be. She was a patient woman. But as time went by, John Eakin fell under the influence of her gentle persuasion. Finally, following an occasion when Crecy had been deeply disappointed over not being able to join a missionary rally at the Presbyterian Church, John surrendered. He loved his wife, and he did want her to be happy. "All right," he said. "If you really want to move to town, we will. I'll build you a house in the shadow of the steeple of the Presbyterian Church." And he did. The house, located across the street from the church, was built of brick, and it was 2 stories tall. There was a graceful cupola on the roof, and the kitchen and dining room were in the basement. Windows on the first and second floors opened onto identical balconies. It was completed in 1835, and John and Crecy Eakin moved to town. "Oh, John," Crecy exclaimed as she walked through the rooms of her new house. "Isn't it beautiful? So lovely. I will never, never leave it. Never." And so Crecy Eakin became a part of the life of Shelbyville. She, of course, became a veritable pillar in the Presbyterian Church, working in all departments and supporting all its worthy causes. Other activities in town claimed her attention also. She made new friends among the ladies and joined them for sewing circles, for musicals, and for teas. She enjoyed going with her husband to parties and banquets at the rambling Holland House, the inn so closely bound to the early history of Shelbyville. She had heard the story of the fabulous banquet at Holland House honoring Andrew Jackson. That, however, was before she moved to town, and she knew of the visits there of John Merle, the outlaw. Her husband had told her of the time Merle came to Shelbyville posing as a noted preacher, and how he ran off with all the money in the collection plates, quite a sizable amount. Merle's sermon had been long and impassioned, John Eakin reported, providing ample time for his henchmen to steal the horses which worshippers had tied in the grove near the church. Crecy, in turn, told John stories she had heard about the Merle gang and their rendezvous at nearby Farmington. "I've seen the house where the gang used to meet. They say it's haunted," Crecy said. They say the ghost of one of the Merle gang's in there. They had a fight in that house one night, quarreling over some money they had stolen, and a man was killed. They say his bloodstains are still on the wall, and nobody can scrub them off." John, being Irish, did not discount the story of the ghost. A later occupant of the house, Mrs. W.C. Ransom, dealt with the ghost legend by the simple act of covering the bloodstains with wallpaper, thus silencing a great deal of talk and speculation. The house burned during a thunderstorm in 1968. Always, when they talked of Holland House, Crecy would add contentedly, "Not even Holland House is as nice as my house." As Crecy grew older, she seemed to love her house more. While she was not what could be called an immaculate housekeeper, the whole house reflected the care and attention she lavished on it. And when guests exclaimed, "What a charming house!" she smiled in agreement. Though she found pleasure in the entire house, her favorite room was her upstairs sitting room. In her later life, this room became her retreat, a haven where she could sort out her memories and commune with her soul. She continued to attend church services as long as she was physically able, long after she was forced to curtail other activities. On pleasant days, she sat in a rocking chair in the yard, greeting friends who passed by and hearing from them the news of the town. By then, nearly everybody called her Aunt Crecy. Lucretia Pearson Eakin died in the early 1890s, leaving the house she loved. But did she, in death, really leave the house? Some residents of Shelbyville say she did not, that she loved that house so much that she would never leave it. For years, her spirit lingered in those familiar rooms. After Mrs. Eakin's death, the property was sold to Ernest Caldwell, a lawyer who moved his family there. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell's daughter, Amy, was born in the house and lived there until she was a young lady. Amy, now Mrs. Sidney D. McGrew of Shelbyville, recalls that members of her family were always aware of the presence of Mrs. Eakin's ghost in the house. "It was a friendly, protective presence, and we were never frightened by it," she says. There were no startling, dramatic manifestations of the ghost's presence, only gentle reminders of a caring spirit. Open windows would be closed by unseen hands during sudden summer showers, or furniture might be moved ever so slightly, or flowers rearranged in a vase, or pictures straightened on the wall. "Amy, run upstairs and pull the windows down. I know it's raining in," her mother might say, and Amy would call from upstairs, "Mama, the windows are already down." "Well, I guess Aunt Crecy beat you to it." Aunt Crecy was credited for many such thoughtful deeds. It was in the upstairs sitting room that Aunt Crecy's presence was most often felt. The swaying of a rocker, the rustle of pages of a book, the rearrangements of items on a table, small reminders of a caring presence. Mrs. McGrew recalls the day when she was about 12 and had carelessly left her bicycle leaning against the double doors that opened onto a side porch. Her mother had cautioned her often about leaving the bike there, pointing out that it would be knocked over by anyone entering the door. The little girl remembered her mother's warning and was walking toward the door to move the bicycle when one of the doors opened. The bicycle was pushed out of the way, and the door closed. Nobody was there. Amy, who was not afraid, knew that Aunt Crecy was taking care of her, reminding her to be more thoughtful. Years passed. Amy married and moved from the house. As her parents grew older, they took an apartment at the Dixie Hotel, long famous for its fine food and as a gathering place for horse fanciers. During the winter, returning to their home for brief periods of time. It was during such a visit in 1931 that fire broke out in that old Eakin house. Mrs. Caldwell had invited some friends to meet her at the house for an afternoon of bridge, and they were playing cards downstairs. Mr. Caldwell was in the kitchen supervising the cooking of a possum. Possum was not included on the menu at the Dixie Hotel, and one of his friends had supplied this treat for him. The bridge players were engrossed in their game, and Mr. Caldwell was totally involved in getting the possum cooked properly. They all heard the town's fire alarm, but nobody really paid any attention to it until firemen burst into the house. "Your house is on fire," they shouted. "What do you want us to save?" Mr. Coldwell directed, first of all, that the hot stove and the possum be carried to safety. As soon as this was taken care of, Mr. Coldwell, against the orders of the firemen, then went upstairs and retrieved his favorite fishing rod. By that time, the blaze was under control. It had apparently started from faulty wiring on the second floor, and it was in that part of the house that the greatest damage was done. The upstairs sitting room, Aunt Crecy's room, was gutted by the flames. In fact, the entire top floor was so badly damaged that it had to be torn away. The lower floor had only smoke and water damage. The old house is lovely again now, but with its upper story missing. It does not look the way it used to when Lucretia Pearson Eakin lived there. Her ghost has gone too. Her presence has not been felt in the house since that day in 1931, when fire destroyed her sitting room, her haven. Alright everyone, I hope you all enjoyed this week's stories. I actually did a little research on the Eakin house and it is still there in Shelbyville to this day. If you would like to learn more about Kathryn Tucker Windham, you can go onto her website at ktwindham.weebly.com. If you have any stories you would like me to read on the show, you can send them on over to storieswithatwang@gmail.com. The show is on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Stories with a Twang Podcast. You know, it would mean an awful lot if you could rate and review the show wherever you listen, and don't forget to share with your friends and family as well. It could really help the show grow. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and until next time, remember that a little twang goes a long way.